They told me I'd lose my son in exactly 6 minutes. I stood in that CPS waiting room with my hands shaking so bad I had to sit on them, and I remember thinking 12 years in the United States Navy, 3 deployments, a Purple Heart on my late husband's flag-draped coffin, and none of it means anything right now. None of it. Because in 6 minutes, a stranger with a clipboard was going to decide whether I was fit to raise my own child, and the person who put that clipboard in her hand was my own sister. My name is Faith Matthews. I'm 35 years old, a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, and for almost 12 years I've worn this uniform like it was armor. God himself stitched together for me. I earned every stripe on it. I bled for it in ways people don't always see. Long nights, longer deployments, a husband I buried with a folded flag in my lap, and a 6-year-old boy who still asks me sometimes if his daddy can see him from up in the clouds. That boy is Ethan. He's the reason I get up every morning. He's got his father's stubborn chin and my mother's laugh, and when he wraps his arms around my neck after a 12-hour shift, I forget every hard thing about my job. I forget the exhaustion. I forget the loneliness of raising a child, mostly on my own since Michael died. Ethan is my whole world, and I built a good one for him. A house on base, a bedroom with dinosaur wallpaper. He picked out himself a routine so steady you could set a clock by it. Between the Child Development Center on base and Ms. Dolores, our sitter of 4 years, who loves Ethan like her own grandbaby, I made sure my son never once felt like he was missing a mother. I made sure of that every single day. But my sister never saw it that way. Olivia is 39, 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, she's measured her own life against mine, and come up short in her own mind even when nobody else was keeping score. She never held a steady job. She bounced from one thing to the next, one relationship to the next, and somewhere along the way my life became the yardstick she used to prove to herself and to everyone else that she wasn't failing. She was just different. At every family dinner, every holiday, she'd find a way to slide the knife in soft enough that nobody else noticed. Must be nice having Uncle Sam pay for everything. I don't know how you sleep at night leaving that baby with strangers. A real mother wouldn't choose a career over her son. I used to laugh it off. I used to tell myself she didn't mean it, that it was just Olivia being Olivia, jealous and restless, and looking for somewhere to put all that unhappiness. I told myself a lot of things to keep the peace. I should have listened closer. Because slowly the comments stopped feeling like jabs and started feeling like a campaign. At my parents' anniversary party, she stood in the kitchen doorway and told my aunts loud enough for half the room to hear that Ethan was basically raising himself. My mother laughed it off. My father changed the subject. Nobody defended me, and I told myself that didn't matter either because I knew the truth. I knew what kind of mother I was. I didn't need anyone's permission to believe it. I was wrong about that too. 3 months ago on an ordinary Tuesday, I came home from a training exercise to find a letter waiting in my mailbox. Official letterhead. County seal. The words swam in front of me before I even finished the first paragraph. An open investigation, allegations of neglect, allegations of emotional abuse, allegations that my son had been left alone for hours at a time, while I was apparently too busy playing soldier to be a mother. I read it 3 times, standing in my own driveway before my legs would let me walk inside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Ethan's bedside and watched him breathe small, and even one arm thrown over his stuffed dolphin, and I tried to think of a single moment, one single moment in 6 years, where I had failed to show up for this child. I couldn't find one. And that terrified me more than anything, because if I couldn't find the crime, how was I supposed to defend myself against it? 2 days later, I got my answer standing barefoot on my own front porch in my robe coffee going cold in my hand. 2 women in gray blazers stood on the other side of my screen door folders tucked under their arms, faces carefully, professionally blank. "Ms. Matthews," the taller one said, "we're with Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you about Ethan." I remember the sound the screen door made when I pushed it open. I remember my own voice steadier than I felt saying, "Of course, come in." And I remember somewhere behind that calm, a small cold thought taking root. A thought I wasn't ready to say out loud, yet not even to myself. Someone did this to me on purpose. And I had a terrible feeling I already knew who. The 2 caseworkers sat across from me at my own kitchen table, And I did the only thing I knew how to do. I cooperated, fully, completely, without a single ounce of defensiveness, because I had absolutely nothing to hide and every intention of proving it. I walked them through Ethan's bedroom myself, pointed out the nightlight shaped like a submarine, the reading chart taped to his closet door with gold stars marching across it. I handed over his pediatrician's records, his report cards, his immunization history. I gave them my duty schedule for the past 6 months, printed and highlighted, showing exactly when I was on base and exactly who had Ethan during every one of those hours. I gave them Ms. Dolores's phone number before they even asked for it. The taller caseworker, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and a tired mouth, looked around my son's spotless room and said quietly, "This isn't what I expected, Ms. Matthews." I remember feeling something loosen in my chest at that. I remember thinking, this is going to be fine. The truth is going to speak for itself. I didn't understand yet how loud a lie can be when someone works hard enough to make it convincing. Because a week later, Patricia called again, her voice different this time. Careful. She told me new evidence had come in, photographs, a video clip, statements from a neighbor claiming they'd seen Ethan playing alone in the front yard for hours while I was, according to the claim, nowhere to be found. I sat on my back steps with the phone pressed so hard to my ear it left a mark, and I asked her to describe the photographs to me. They were time-stamped. They showed my house, my yard, my son. And they were wrong. Every single one wrong in a way that made my skin crawl once I understood how wrong. Because I remembered that afternoon. I remembered it exactly. I had been 30 feet away in the garage door, wide open, watching Ethan the entire time, while I sorted through Michael's old toolbox, something I did most Sundays, something that made me feel close to him. The photograph had been cropped. Cropped to cut the garage clean out of the frame. Someone hadn't just witnessed a moment. Someone had engineered one. I started keeping a mental list after that, quiet and careful the way I used to track supply inconsistencies on deployment, when something didn't add up and I needed to find the leak before it sank the whole operation. Who knew my schedule well enough to catch me at exactly the wrong angle? Who had access to old family photos of my house, my yard, my son going back years? Who had spent months laying groundwork with our extended family, softening them up with little comments about my parenting, long before any of this began? I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to say her name out loud yet, not even in the privacy of my own head, because saying it made it real, and real meant my own sister had been quietly building a case to take my son away from me. The following Sunday, my mother called to invite me to a family dinner, her voice bright in that particular way that means she's nervous about something and hoping I won't notice. I noticed. I went anyway because some stubborn part of me still believed that if I just showed up, just kept being exactly who I was, the truth would eventually outshine whatever story was being told about me. Olivia was already there when I arrived, sitting at the head of the table like she'd been given a promotion, and the moment I walked in, I watched something flicker across her face there, and gone so fast that if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it entirely. Satisfaction, pure and quiet and ugly. "Faith," she said, standing to hug me, her voice syrupy sweet in front of our parents. "How are you holding up? This whole CPS thing must be so stressful." I let her hug me. I let my arms go around her back, and I felt how thin she'd gotten, how brittle, and for one strange second I almost felt sorry for whatever emptiness in her needed this so badly. Almost. "I'm holding up fine," I said. The truth tends to do that for people. Something in her eyes went sharp before she smoothed it back into concern. Later that night after dinner, I overheard her in the kitchen with my Aunt Rosalind, her voice pitched low but not low enough. "I just think it's sad," she was saying, "that it takes something like this for people to finally see what's really going on in that house. This time CPS is actually going to take him. You watch." I stood frozen in the hallway with a stack of dessert plates in my hands, and I made a decision right there in that shadowed corridor. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to defend myself to a room full of people who'd already made up their minds. I was going to let the process play out, let the truth do the slow, patient work that lies can never quite manage, and I was going to hold on to my son with both hands the entire time. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the county. My hands were steadier this time when I opened it, though my heart wasn't. CPS had completed their preliminary investigation. A final determination hearing was scheduled. I read the date 3 times, then folded the letter carefully and set it on the counter next to Ethan's lunchbox, and I thought about my husband somewhere beyond all of this mess, and what he would tell me if he could. I already knew he'd tell me to stand my ground. Marines don't retreat. And neither, I decided, watching my son's small shadow move across the hallway floor, was I. The family meeting happened on a Thursday evening at my parents' house, called together like some kind of tribunal I hadn't agreed to attend. My father phoned that morning, his voice careful in a way that told me everything before he said a single word. "Faith, honey, we think it would be good if the whole family sat down together. About Ethan, about everything going on." I almost said no. Some part of me knew exactly what I was walking into, but another part of me, the part that still believed in the value of standing your ground with your chin up rather than hiding from a fight, told me I needed to be in that room. Whatever was going to be said about me, I wasn't going to let it be said behind my back. Olivia had clearly been preparing for this moment for weeks. She sat curled into the corner of my parents' sofa, a box of tissues within arm's reach like a prop she'd positioned in advance, and when I walked in with Ethan's hand in mine, she looked up at me with an expression so carefully arranged, so perfectly sorrowful, that for a moment I almost admired the performance. "I just want you to know," she said, before anyone else could speak, her voice trembling right on cue, "that everything I've done because I love that little boy. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to him and I'd stayed silent." My mother reached over and squeezed her hand. My father nodded along like she'd just recited scripture. I stood there in the doorway with my son's small fingers curled around mine, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. Faith. My mother said gently, turning to me, "We love you. We do, but maybe it's time to think about whether the Navy is really the right path anymore, for Ethan's sake." I felt Ethan's grip tighten on my hand, and I looked down to find him staring up at me with those wide, watchful eyes that missed nothing, and something in me steadied. I knelt down right there in front of everyone and told him to go find his coloring books in Grandma's craft room, and I waited until he was safely out of earshot before I stood back up and looked my mother directly in the eye. "I'm not leaving the Navy," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "The Navy has given my son health insurance that covers every doctor's appointment he's ever needed. It's given him a home. It's given him a mother who can look him in the eye and tell him she's building something that matters. I am not walking away from that because someone in this family decided to believe a story instead of asking me for the truth." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when people don't like what they're hearing but don't have anything to say back to it. I thought about Michael then, the way I found myself thinking about him more and more during those difficult weeks. He'd been a Marine for 8 years before we met, and even after he left active duty, the uniform never really left him. I remembered a conversation we'd had late one night with Ethan, just a baby asleep between us, when he told me that the hardest part of service wasn't the deployments or the danger, it was coming home to people who couldn't understand what you'd sacrificed to keep them safe. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for wearing that uniform, Faith," he'd said, tracing his thumb along my collarbone. "Not ever. It's the best thing about you." He'd died 18 months later, a training accident that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the terrible randomness of the world, and some days that memory was the only thing keeping my spine straight. I decided standing in that living room that I was going to fight. Not with shouting, not with accusations I couldn't yet prove, but with the same quiet discipline that had gotten me through every hard thing the Navy had ever asked of me. My lawyer, a calm gray-haired man named Robert Alvarez, who'd handled Michael's estate years before, met with me 2 days later in his cramped downtown office. I laid out everything, the cropped photograph, the timeline that didn't add up, the neighbor's statement that felt rehearsed rather than remembered. He listened without interrupting, jotting notes in a leather notebook, and when I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "CPS hasn't made a final determination yet," he said, "and I want you to trust the process, Faith. Sometimes these things take longer than they should specifically, because the truth is more complicated than the accusation. There was something in the way he said it, measured, deliberate, almost too calm, that made me sit up straighter. It was the kind of calm I recognized from my own training, the calm of someone who already knows how a mission is going to end, but can't say so until the moment is right. "Robert," I said slowly, "do you know something I don't?" He gave me the faintest smile, the kind that gives nothing away and everything away at the same time. I know that the truth has a way of documenting itself, even when people don't realize they're leaving a trail. Trust me a little longer. I left his office that afternoon with more questions than answers, but strangely more hope than I'd carried in weeks. 2 days later, another letter arrived. CPS was requesting a formal meeting at their office. Faith and Ethan Matthews present in person, final determination pending review. I read the words final determination pending review probably a dozen times that night, unable to decide if they sounded like an ending or a beginning. I packed Ethan's favorite dinosaur backpack the next morning with a coloring book and his father's old dog tags tucked in the front pocket for luck, and I told him we were going on a little trip together. He looked up at me with Michael's stubborn chin set firm and asked, "Are we in trouble, Mom?" I knelt down, took his small face in my hands, and told him the only true thing I had to offer. "No, baby. We've never done anything wrong. Sometimes the truth just takes its time catching up to the people who need to hear it." The CPS office sat in a squat government building downtown, all fluorescent lights and worn linoleum, the kind of place that smells like burnt coffee and old paperwork, no matter what time of day you walk in. I held Ethan's hand tight as we crossed the parking lot, and I could feel him matching his steps to mine, small, and trusting no idea that today might be the day strangers decided whether he got to keep living in the only home he'd ever known. My parents were already in the waiting room when we arrived. So was Olivia. She'd dressed for the occasion, a soft cardigan, hair pulled back neat and modest, the whole picture of a concerned aunt who'd only ever wanted what was best. She'd clearly made sure the entire family would be there to witness this. I understood, watching her rise to greet us with that same rehearsed sorrow on her face, that she wanted an audience. She wanted every single person who mattered to me to watch the moment I lost my son. "Faith," she said, reaching for my arm. I let her touch me because pulling away would have given her something to point to later. "I know today is hard, but I really believe this is for the best, for Ethan." I didn't answer her. I kept my eyes on the closed office door at the end of the hallway, and I kept my hand wrapped around my son's. She leaned in close as we waited, her voice dropping to something only I could hear, something with an edge underneath the sympathy that she couldn't quite hide anymore now that the moment had almost arrived. "I told you, a Navy career can't replace a mother. I tried to warn you years ago." I looked at her, then really looked, and something in my face must have surprised her because she took half a step back. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even afraid anymore, not the way I had been weeks ago. I felt strangely, unnaturally calm, the same calm that used to settle over me right before a difficult operation, when all the planning was done, and all that was left was to see it through. "You should be careful what you wish for, Olivia," I said quietly. "Sometimes it comes back around in ways you don't expect." She blinked, unsettled, and opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment the office door opened. Patricia stepped out first, her expression unreadable, followed by a second caseworker I hadn't met before, an older man with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was carrying a thick manila envelope sealed with an official stamp across the flap. My mother made a small sound beside me. My father reached for her hand. And Olivia. I watched her out of the corner of my eye. Olivia's face bloomed with something she couldn't quite suppress. Anticipation. Triumph, barely leashed. She thought that envelope held the order to take my son. I felt the room tilt slightly, that particular vertigo of standing at the edge of the worst moment of your life, and I knelt down in front of Ethan one more time before anything else could happen. I straightened the collar of his little button-down shirt, the one he'd picked out himself that morning because he said it made him look like a sailor like Mommy. I looked into his eyes, so much like his father's, and I told him the truest thing I knew. Whatever happens in there, you are loved. You have always been loved. Nothing that gets said in that room changes that. Do you understand me? He nodded solemn in the way only small children can be solemn, and wrapped his arms around my neck, and I held him there for one long moment, breathing in the smell of his shampoo, memorizing the weight of him against me, because some terrified animal part of my brain was convinced this might be the last time I got to do this so freely. "Ms. Matthews," Patricia said, her voice gentle but professional, "would you and your family come into the conference room, please?" We filed in together, me, Ethan, my parents, Olivia, trailing just behind with an expression she was fighting to keep composed. The conference room was small and windowless, a long table down the center, folders stacked neatly at one end. Patricia and the older caseworker took seats across from us. My lawyer Robert was already there, standing near the window, that same unreadable calm on his face that I'd noticed in his office days before. Olivia settled into a chair at the far end of the table, close enough to watch everything, and I saw her hands twist together in her lap, saw the flicker of impatience cross her face when the silence stretched a beat too long. She wanted this over. She wanted to see my face crumble. The older caseworker cleared his throat and reached for the sealed envelope on the table in front of him. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to explain the process you're about to see today. This investigation has taken longer than any of us anticipated, and I want you all to understand why, because what's in this file is going to be relevant to everyone in this room." Olivia shifted in her seat. My mother's grip on my father's hand tightened. "Ethan," Patricia said gently, turning to my son with a warm, practiced smile, "would you like to go color in the room next door for a few minutes while the grown-ups talk?" Ethan looked up at me, uncertain, and I nodded, forcing my face into something reassuring, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. A young intern led him out, and the door clicked shut behind them, and the room seemed to shrink around the rest of us. The older caseworker picked up the sealed envelope, turned it over once in his hands as if weighing it, and looked directly at me. "Ms. Matthews," he said, "what I'm about to share with this family is going to be difficult for some of you to hear. But it's time everyone in this room understood exactly what has been happening these past several months." I felt every muscle in my body go taut. Beside me, I heard Olivia's breath catch just slightly, just enough that I noticed. He broke the seal. The caseworker withdrew a thick stack of papers, and the first thing he did before reading a single word aloud was look directly at Olivia. Something in that look made her sit up straighter, made her smile falter at the edges like wax starting to melt. "This is the final determination from our investigation into the welfare of Ethan Matthews," he said, his voice even and official, the kind of voice trained to deliver difficult news without flinching. "I'll summarize the findings." He turned to me. "Ms. Matthews, based on a comprehensive review of school records, medical history, work schedules, home inspections, and interviews with caregivers, teachers, and character witnesses, this department finds no evidence whatsoever of neglect, abuse, or endangerment. Ethan is, by every measure we assess, a healthy, well-adjusted, and deeply loved child. You are found to be a fit and exemplary parent." The words hit me like a wave, warm and overwhelming, and I felt my eyes burn even as I fought to keep my composure. My mother let out a small, broken sound beside me. My father's hand went slack in hers. But the caseworker wasn't finished. "What concerns this department far more," he continued, and now his eyes moved slowly, deliberately to the far end of the table, "is the pattern of evidence submitted throughout this investigation, all of which has now been independently verified as fabricated." The room went utterly silent. The photographs submitted as evidence of neglect were digitally cropped to remove context that would have disproven the claims. Metadata analysis confirms the images were edited using photo software on multiple occasions, always shortly before being forwarded to this department. The video clip submitted was similarly edited, spliced from two separate recordings, taken weeks apart to create the impression of a single continuous event that never actually occurred. I heard Olivia's chair creak as she shifted, and I didn't look at her. I couldn't yet. I was still holding my breath, waiting for the rest. "Additionally," the caseworker said, sliding another document from the folder, "phone records and email correspondence subpoenaed as part of this investigation trace the origin of every falsified report, every doctored photograph, and every coached witness statement to a single individual. He set the paper on the table and turned it so it faced down the length of the table. Olivia Carter. I finally let myself look at her then. Her face had gone the color of old paper, all the careful sorrow drained out of it, replaced by something raw and cornered. My mother turned to her, slowly disbelief written across every line of her face. Olivia, she whispered, is this true? I was trying to protect him. Olivia said, her voice cracking, but there was no conviction left in it, just panic dressed up as righteousness. You don't understand what I saw. You saw nothing. The caseworker said, not unkindly but firmly, because there was nothing to see. What you did, Ms. Carter, was manufacture evidence over a period of several months, coach at least one neighbor into providing a false statement, and file repeated fraudulent reports with this department, all of which constitutes a serious criminal offense under state law. I sat very still through all of it, hands folded in my lap, and I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. Somewhere in the last few minutes, the fear that had lived in my chest for 3 straight months had simply left. In its place was something quieter. Not triumph, exactly. Something closer to grief for however many years I'd spent hoping my sister might someday be capable of loving me without needing to tear me down first. There's one more matter, Patricia said gently, sliding a final document toward Robert, my lawyer, who accepted it with a small, knowing nod. Given the severity and duration of the fraudulent reporting, and the demonstrable harm it caused, this department is required to refer this case to local law enforcement. A detective will need to speak with everyone in this room, but particularly with Ms. Carter before this meeting concludes. Olivia's composure finally shattered completely. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising, panic bleeding through every syllable. I'm her sister. I was worried about my nephew. This is insane. Ms. Carter, the older caseworker said quietly, we have message threads where you discuss in detail the specific angles needed to make the photographs convincing. We have you instructing a neighbor on what to say if contacted by investigators. I'd advise you to speak with an attorney before you say anything further. My father put his head in his hands. My mother reached for me across the table, her fingers trembling against mine, and though part of me wanted to pull away, another part of me, the tired part, the part that had carried this alone for 3 months, let her hold on. Faith, she whispered, I am so sorry. We should have believed you. We should have known. I didn't say anything right away. I looked past her at Olivia, who sat frozen at the end of the table with 2 officers now standing quietly near the door, waiting to speak with her once the meeting concluded. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I need to see my son, I said finally, my voice steady, and Patricia nodded and rose to bring Ethan back in from the next room. He came through the door with a crayon drawing clutched in one hand, oblivious to everything that had just happened, and the moment he saw me, his whole face lit up the way it always did, like I was the safest place in the entire world. He ran to me, and I scooped him up, heavier than he used to be, but still small enough to fit against my chest, and I held him there while somewhere behind us 2 officers began walking Olivia gently but firmly toward a separate room. The next hour moved like something out of a fog, disconnected images strung together without much sense of time passing between them. I remember sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hallway with Ethan asleep against my shoulder, worn out from the long morning, while a detective named Sergeant Reyes explained the process that would follow. I remember my mother's voice thin and shaking, asking questions nobody had good answers to. Is she going to jail? What happens now? How long has this been going on? Through the half-open door of the room where they'd taken her, I could hear pieces of Olivia's voice rising and falling, moving between anger and desperation, and something that almost sounded like grief for herself. I only wanted to protect him, she kept saying over and over as if repetition might make it true. You don't understand what it's like watching your sister get everything while you have nothing. I understood actually more than she probably realized. I understood loneliness. I understood watching other people's lives look easier from a distance, without knowing the weight they were carrying underneath. What I didn't understand, what I don't think I'll ever understand, was how a person decides that the solution to their own pain is to try to take away someone else's child. Sergeant Reyes came out, eventually notebook in hand, expression carefully professional. He explained that Olivia would be charged with several counts related to filing false reports and fabricating evidence that the digital forensics team had recovered enough material from her phone and laptop to build a solid case that this kind of thing unfortunately happened more often than people realized in custody and family disputes, always with devastating consequences for the children caught in the middle. "You did everything right, Ms. Matthews," he told me, and something in the simple, unadorned way he said it undid something in my chest that I'd been holding tight for 3 months. I felt tears finally break loose, quiet ones, the kind that don't ask permission, sliding down my face while Ethan slept against my shoulder, none the wiser. My parents approached me carefully after that, the way you approach something fragile, uncertain if it will break further or simply hold together despite everything. My father, a man I had never once in my life seen cry, had tears standing in his eyes when he finally spoke. "We failed you," he said. "We let her convince us of something we should have known wasn't true. You've never given us a single reason to doubt you, and we let her poison that anyway. I'm ashamed of that, Faith. I really am." I didn't have a neat, forgiving speech ready for him. I was too tired, too wrung out from months of fighting a war I couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it with me. "I heard you," I said instead, honestly. "I heard everyone in that living room asking me to give up my career, my life, because you believed her over me without ever once asking me what actually happened. That's going to take time to get past. I'm not there yet." My mother nodded, wiping her eyes, and didn't try to argue with me or rush me toward forgiveness before I was ready to offer it. That alone told me something had shifted in her, something real. Olivia was formally arrested 2 days later. I wasn't there when it happened. I heard about it secondhand from my mother, who called sounding hollowed out and exhausted in a way I'd never heard from her before. Olivia had been charged with multiple counts of filing false reports, evidence tampering, and witness tampering related to the neighbor she'd coached. Her bail was set, her court date scheduled months out, and in the meantime, word had already started spreading through the small, tightly wound circle of family and old family friends who'd once believed every word she said about me. People I'd known my whole life stopped calling her. An aunt who'd once nodded along at every one of Olivia's complaints about my parenting sent me a long apologetic text I didn't have the energy to fully read that week. It seemed the same community that had been so quick to whisper about the Navy mother, who supposedly couldn't be bothered to raise her own child, was now considerably less interested in defending the person who'd built an elaborate lie to try to take that child away. I didn't feel vindicated exactly. Mostly I just felt tired, the deep bone tired that comes after finally putting down a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. That evening I drove home with Ethan buckled into his booster seat in the back, watching the last light drain out of the sky over the highway. He'd been quiet the whole ride, unusually quiet for a 6-year-old, and I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, wondering how much he'd absorbed of everything that happened that day. How much a child that age understands even when the adults around him think he's too young to notice. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the porch light glowing warm against the early evening dark, he unbuckled himself and climbed out. And instead of running ahead the way he usually did, he stopped and looked up at me, his small face serious in a way that broke something open in my chest. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we safe now?" I knelt down on the concrete in front of him right there in the driveway and took his face gently in both hands the same way I had that morning, before we walked into the CPS office, except this time there was nothing left to fear on the other side of the answer. I opened my mouth to tell him yes, that everything was fine now that the hard part was over. And then I stopped myself because I realized there was something truer. I needed him to hear, something I needed to say out loud, maybe as much for myself as for him. I looked into my son's eyes so much like his father's, and I gave him the truest answer I had. "We always were," I said. "Even on the hardest days, baby. We were always safe because I was never going to let anything happen to you. Not ever." He nodded slowly the way children do when they're working hard to understand something too big for them. And then he did something that undid me completely. He wrapped his small arms around my neck and held on tight, not saying anything else, just holding on the way you hold on to something you're afraid might slip away if you loosen your grip. I held him back just as fiercely, right there in the driveway, the porch light casting long shadows across the pavement, and for the first time in 3 months I let myself really believe that the worst of it was finally behind us. A month passed. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a bill, and I almost missed it entirely before I recognized the county seal in the corner. My hands didn't shake this time when I opened it. Case closed, no further action required. All allegations found to be without merit. I read it standing at my own kitchen counter with Ethan doing homework at the table behind me, and I felt something in my chest finally truly unclench after months of holding itself braced for the next blow. Around that same time, the Navy held a small ceremony recognizing several sailors for outstanding service, and to my genuine surprise, my name was on the list. My commanding officer told me with a small, knowing smile that leadership had been watching how I'd handled the past few months, the investigation, the personal turmoil, all of it, without ever once letting it affect my performance or my responsibilities. "That's not nothing, Lieutenant Commander," he said. "That's exactly the kind of steadiness we need in people we trust with real responsibility." I stood at that ceremony in my dress uniform ribbons pinned in careful rows and looked out into the small crowd of family and colleagues gathered to watch. Ethan sat in the front row between my parents, dressed in his little button-down shirt, the one that made him feel like a sailor, and when they called my name, and I stepped forward to receive my commendation, I watched his whole face light up with a pride so pure and uncomplicated, it nearly brought me to my knees right there on the stage. Afterward, he ran to me across the grass, arms outstretched, and I lifted him up despite how heavy he was getting, and he pressed his face into my shoulder and said muffled against my uniform, "I want to be brave like you when I grow up, Mom." I don't think I've ever felt prouder of anything in my entire life than I did in that moment. My parents approached slowly after the ceremony, my father holding a small bouquet of flowers he'd clearly bought at the grocery store on the way over, awkward and sincere in a way that suited him. "We're proud of you," he said. "We should have said that a long time ago, and we should have said it without needing everything that happened to make us understand it. I hope you know that." I accepted the flowers. I accepted the apology too, though I want to be honest about something. Accepting it didn't mean forgetting the months when they'd stood in that living room and asked me to give up everything I'd built because they believed a story over their own daughter. I told them as much gently but plainly, and I told them that rebuilding trust would take time, real time, not a single conversation and a bouquet of grocery store flowers, however well-intentioned. They nodded, they understood. And slowly over the weeks that followed, we did start rebuilding something one careful conversation at a time. Olivia's case moved through the system slowly the way these things do. I wasn't there for most of it. I didn't attend her arraignment, didn't sit through the preliminary hearings, because I'd made peace with the fact that my energy belonged to my son, and to moving forward, not to watching my sister face the consequences of choices she'd made entirely on her own. I heard through my mother that she eventually accepted a plea agreement that she'd be facing probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. I heard that most of the family had quietly, without any dramatic announcement, stopped inviting her to things. People don't forget easily when someone tries to use a child as a weapon. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard all this. I felt sadness, mostly the particular kind of sadness reserved for people who could have been so much more than the worst thing they ever did, if only they'd chosen differently somewhere along the way. I hoped quietly that the counseling helped her. I hoped she found whatever it was she'd been missing that made her decide my happiness was something to be dismantled, rather than simply lived alongside. But I didn't reach out to her, and as the months passed, I stopped waiting for her to reach out to me either. Life in the meantime settled back into its rhythms. Ethan went back to being a regular 6-year-old worried about spelling tests and dinosaur facts, rather than caseworkers and sealed envelopes. I went back to my regular schedule at the base, though something in me had shifted permanently, some new layer of resolve I hadn't known I needed until I'd been forced to find it. One Saturday afternoon, months after everything had finally settled, I stood on my back porch, Watching Ethan chase a soccer ball across the yard, laughing so hard, he could barely keep his feet under him, the late afternoon sun turning everything gold around him. And I thought about how close I'd come to losing all of this, to losing him, over lies that had nearly been convincing enough to work. I stood there a long while just watching him run, and I thought about everything it had taken to get to this ordinary golden afternoon. I thought about the uniform hanging in my closet, and how many people had once looked at it and decided it made me less of a mother instead of more of one. I thought about my sister somewhere across town starting over in whatever shape her life would now take, carrying the weight of choices she'd made all on her own. And I thought about the sealed envelope that had once held either my worst nightmare or my vindication, and how strange it was that both possibilities had lived inside the same piece of paper until the moment it was opened. That evening, after Ethan had worn himself out completely and finally sat still long enough to eat dinner, he looked up at me across the table with the kind of unguarded curiosity only children seem to manage. "Mom, was Aunt Olivia trying to be mean to us?" I set down my fork and thought carefully about how to answer him, because I never wanted to teach my son to hate even someone who had genuinely earned the right to be resented. "I think Aunt Olivia was very unhappy," I said slowly. "And instead of figuring out how to fix her own unhappiness, she tried to take something good away from us instead. That was wrong of her, and there are going to be consequences for what she did. But you don't have to carry any anger about it. That's not your job. Your job is just to keep being exactly who you are." He nodded, satisfied with that answer in the straightforward way children accept things adults still struggle with, and went back to his dinner, already moving on to a story about something that happened at school that day. I watched him talk animated and easy, without a single trace of the fear that had shadowed him during those difficult months. And I understood then that whatever else had been taken from us during that ordeal, we'd gotten the most important thing back, completely intact: his sense of safety, his belief that the world was fundamentally a good place, his trust that his mother would always stand between him and anything trying to hurt him. Later that week, my parents came over for Sunday dinner, something that had become a quiet, careful ritual between us since everything happened. My father helped Ethan build a model airplane at the kitchen table, while my mother and I stood together at the stove, and at one point, without any particular prompting, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "I keep thinking about that day at the CPS office," she said quietly. "How calm you were. I don't know how you did it, Faith. I would have fallen apart." I thought about that question for a moment before answering, because it deserved a real answer rather than something easy. "I think the Navy taught me that panic doesn't actually protect anyone," I said. "It just uses up energy you need for the things that actually matter. I was terrified. I want you to know that. I was more scared in that waiting room than I've ever been in any deployment. But I learned a long time ago that you can be terrified and still function, still show up, still do the next right thing in front of you. That's not the absence of fear. That's just what getting through it looks like." She was quiet for a moment, watching Ethan across the room, laughing at something my father said, and then she said something that stayed with me long after that evening ended. "I think I finally understand what people mean when they say the uniform doesn't make the person. You were already like this, weren't you, before the Navy? This was always who you were." I didn't have a perfect answer for that. Maybe some of both was true. Maybe I'd always had this particular kind of stubborn steadiness in me, and maybe 12 years of service had simply given it somewhere to grow, some structure to hold on to during the moments when it would have been so much easier to break. A few weeks later, the Navy held a family day event at the base, and I brought Ethan along dressed in his little sailor-inspired outfit that had become something of a favorite since the ceremony. We walked together across the wide green lawn near the flagpole, the American flag snapping crisp and bright against a clear blue sky, and Ethan ran ahead of me toward a group of other kids playing near the fountain, laughing completely unburdened, exactly the way a 6-year-old should be. I stood there for a moment alone watching him go, and I found myself saying something out loud, quietly, mostly to myself, though I like to think some part of it was meant for anyone who'd ever doubted what kind of mother I was. "They told me this uniform meant I couldn't be a good mother," I said, watching the flag move against the wind. "But this uniform is exactly what taught me how. It taught me that being a good mother isn't measured by how many hours you spend at home. It's measured by whether you show up every single time, no matter what it costs you, and stand between your child and anything trying to hurt them. That's what I did. That's what I'll always do. Ethan turned back toward me from across the lawn, waved with both arms over his head, the way he did when he wanted to make sure I was watching, and I waved back, feeling something settle deep and permanent in my chest. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and steadier than that. Peace, maybe. The particular peace that comes after you fought for something with everything you have and won, and finally get to simply live in the life you fought for. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight to protect someone you love against people who were supposed to be on your side? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. We share stories like Faith's every single day here, stories about the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground when everyone around you has already decided who you are. So if this one stayed with you, hit subscribe and stay close, because there's always another story waiting, and I don't want you to miss a single one of them. Thank you for walking through this one with me. We'll see you in the next story.